We start again today. Hello, Luke.
Hello.
How are you today?
Good, I'm good, thanks, Jordan. Are you?
Yeah.
Good.
A lot going on. There's people having problems joining, apparently. And there's some people in the office helping me, but they're also running the doctorate teaching on Zoom at the same time. I'm recording this, and they're also having issue people joining that. So it's a bit of a kind of crisis, but we've got 20 people in, so I think it's not everyone. I think it's to do with how new your version of Zoom is. If you've updated your Zoom, it works apparently, but yeah, I didn't know that though. So, but it's great to be joined by the speakers today. It's going to be a really good session. Yeah, is Adrian here as well?
So yeah, I've just put in the chat box. I don't know if you guys saw it, but Adrian's is at another meeting. I think it's the Organic World Congress, and he's participating in that. So he's going to be here in 30 minutes.
That's fine.
In here, and I missed a keynote actually early this morning, so I was in another meeting as well for the Ready Healthy Eat project. But I'd like to catch up with that because it was Moya who was doing the keynote, and I always enjoy listening to Moya talk. So
yeah, the keynotes are really good this morning. Really, really good.
Good. Okay, so should we just give it another couple of minutes then to let people filter in?
Yeah, that's fine. So just to say that we are recording this, and we'll have another kind of check that everyone sent a consent form that we can then use this and put it on a platform afterwards so people can view it afterwards. So the presentation should be 15 minutes followed by 5 minutes of questions. We only have 4 presenters in this session, so there will be a little bit of leeway either way. But we run now through till 12:30 when there's another break.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. So because we've only got 4 speakers, because we've got 4 speakers, that gives us a bit more breathing room, doesn't it? So we'll try and go with sort of 15-20 minute talks and then some questions, and then if we've got a bit of time at the end, maybe there might be some cross-cutting things which we can come back to as a group if we've got sort of 10-15 minutes at the close here. So
great, sounds good.
Yeah, just give it another minute.
So
all the speakers in the room.
So I can see Eleanor. Hello, Eleanor. And Stefan's here as well. Yeah, so we don't necessarily have to go in the order on the agenda. That was just written alphabetically by the first author's name. So if someone else is ready, they can always start first. If the first speaker, so it's University of Bristol, first one.
That's me.
Okay.
Do you want me to start? Are we?
What's the time? Yeah, go for it. Okay, so the first presentation, healing precarity in food systems, CSAs, COVID-19, and complexity. And this is from University of Bristol, as I said. I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Thanks, Jordan.
Right, can you see that okay and hear me fine?
I see that.
Great. Great, thank you. So yeah, my name's Lauren Blake. I'm lecturing human geography at the University of Bristol. I research agri-food systems. I'm presenting this as a joint piece of work developed with my colleague Jessica and Chohan, who's also on this call, and will be very happy to join me in all the questions if there are any and so on at the end. And yeah, we first actually worked together on a project looking at farming, conservation, environmental challenges in Colombia. And last year, in the first months of the pandemic, Jessica and I were, like many, feeling quite stuck, and our planned field trips to Colombia for our sort of main research for our roles had been cancelled for the foreseeable future and still have not resumed. And yeah, our research focuses on, both of us focus on agri-food, and there was a food crisis happening around us, provoked by COVID, and we were basically just a bit too curious and impatient to ignore it. And there was an edited book doing calls for abstract sustainability and complexity towards a post-disciplinary approach, with food being one of the topics. So we used this as the impetus that we were looking for and put in a proposal to do some exploratory research on food systems and COVID as the basis of the chapter. We then developed this further focusing on the precarity the study explored for a special issue on precarious foodscapes for the journal Food, Culture and Society. They're both forthcoming and should be published next year. So this presentation is based on that research and the latter paper in particular, and focusing on CSAs. So for anyone unfamiliar with that, community supported agriculture in the UK, which I'll be explaining a bit later. I'm going to skip over these first few because it's just a sort of scene setting, and I'm assuming that hopefully correctly, sorry if not, that most people are kind of fairly familiar with the issues in food systems, which is why they're attending this symposium. So yeah, why food and complexity, why systems thinking, why food and pandemics. So essentially just the basis being that food systems are highly complex, there are many problems, social, environmental, economic, health-wise, all of it, and you therefore need a kind of fairly an approach that can deal with this complexity. And then I'll talk in a minute as well about how this is relevant in particular to pandemics. So food systems and pandemics, there's loads of research in the more sort of like bio-natural sciences looking at food systems and their relation to pandemics, and how they're kind of being seen as the likely cause of future pandemics that are going to be more likely, and they're probably going to be coming out of like intensive farming systems. And that's not just the sort of livestock side, although that is part of it, but it's also a lot of like general habitat destruction, encroachment of habitats and so on, as well as like environmental change, climate change and so on. Oh, this is in funny order, sorry. I was expecting that to go normally. So yeah, and we've taken a systems approach to try and address some of this complexity. And this is just some outlining that. So a system is a complex whole of related parts, a network or set interdependent components that form a complex whole linked by interactions. And the version of sort of food systems that we're using, the definition is socio-ecological, complex and adaptive, encompassing interactions by multiple actors and institutions with numerous positive and negative feedback loops that are difficult to capture. They're generally, systems thinking is generally applied for wicked problems, problems that are complex and intractable. So that's why we're kind of trying to take this more holistic approach to it. And how about precarity in food systems? So global production distribution systems that engender insecure access to food, poor nutritional quality, variety, ecological damage, and dependence on insecure migrant labour, which has detrimental impacts on human, more than human, and environmental health. So food systems precarity is partly evident in the direct link between dominant food production strategies and the emergence of epidemics and pandemics. So that's why we're kind of interested in looking at the case study of a local food system in the context of a global pandemic. Pandemics further reveal the inherent precarity within food systems as they present system shocks and exacerbate vulnerability and risk. So a holistic food systems approach interlinks multifaceted precarity. In the context of pandemics, this pertains to dramatically increased food insecurity, difficulties in urban food acquisition, globally interrupted food and input supply chains, exacerbated unstable employment and poor wages, e.g. migrant farm labour or those working in the hospitality sector, as well as the precarious health of agroecosystems. So COVID-19 has emphasised the faults of this current global food system and its lack of sustainability and deeply rooted precarity. In particular, we're taking the concept of the sort of the McMichael's corporate food regime and the sort of the just-in-time structure, as Lang puts it, just-in-time structure of the corporate food regime relies on a web of finely tuned trading routes that deterritorialize food, i.e. detachment from places and communities. Food is at once from everywhere and nowhere. So this is why we were then wanting to look at CSAs, and just going to give a brief mention on how why we chose CSAs. So while CSAs don't necessarily all declare themselves as sort of agroecological approach, they tend to engender a lot of the principles of agroecological farming systems. which seek to build sort of sustainable and resilient farming. So they focus on diversity and complexity and integrating social connections to food. So agroecology adopts an interdisciplinary lens which connects ecology, socioeconomy, culture, and politics. It is a science that redesigns farms to prioritise biodiversity and reduces the use of externally sourced inputs, both organic and synthetic. Equally, it is a global social movement and practice which emphasises the embedded socio-ecological knowledge of smallholder farmers. So this is, we therefore see agroecology as one of the ways to take a systems approach to food. And the CSA model reframes the idea of food sustainability towards a systems approach that integrates human, ecological, social, and economic well-being. So a little bit more about CSAs. So anyone who gets a veg box from a CSA was likely aware that demand skyrocketed in between March and June last year. So CSAs are it's a model of a community-orientated smallholding social enterprise which works to reshape the relationship between producers and consumers. Organizational structures and business models vary greatly from farm to farm, but they commonly approach food production using a socio-ecological philosophy. They're small community-owned or oriented farms that reconnect food, people, and the environment. And these sites are complex cases that demonstrate the precarity experienced by small producers in the UK, but also the flexible strategies they established to counter and begin healing precarity in local food systems. When considering the wider context, using Michael's corporate food regime, CSAs have emerged in part to heal precarity in food systems. They exist to challenge and heal multi-scale precarity across elements of the food system. I just want to sort of caveat this though by saying, importantly, they do not exist apart from the corporate food regime. They emerge within and from precarity to challenge and undo this. Thus, they do not escape the adverse consequences of a food system that favours corporate or industrial scale production, whilst working to challenge these inequalities and vulnerabilities. Individual agroecological farming units dream alternative possibilities to corporate-led agriculture. However, alone they cannot eradicate precarity in the food system. So we conducted a qualitative survey that was done primarily online, some of it was done by phone, and this was with 15 diverse CSAs across the USA. So this is a map here taken from the CSA website. Not all CSAs are affiliated even through this organisation, so there are many others as well, but this gives an idea of the spread of them, and we managed to get, to include CSAs from different parts across England, Wales, and Scotland, and it was very much an exploratory understanding of how they coped and adapted to the shocks produced by the pandemic. We wanted to explore the experiences of small food chains through the CSAs in the UK under the conditions of the shocks from the pandemic, and how they coped with drastically changing consumer and production demands to better inform debates around sustainability and resilience. We also brought in some comparison with a large survey that was conducted by the Food Foundation, COVID-19 UK Veg Box report as well, so that was also quite helpful to compare. So some of the key findings. So CSAs are structured around, as I sort of mentioned earlier, they're structured around reconnecting human health, which is both sort of mental and nutritional, and environmental health and social connections between producers and consumers. So one of the first things that we sort of concluded from our research was that they're really nimble and resourceful. They all experience this like really sharp, sudden, steep increase in demand in the early parts. So the research was conducted between sort of like June and August last year. So just as they were coming out of the kind of the worst of it. And they'd all, every single one had experienced this really sudden steep increase in demand. And they were amazingly resourceful at finding ways to either continue more or less unaffected or many of them managed to scale up quite drastically and take on as many new customers as they possibly could, or increase the general demands for food supply that with their existing customers. And one of the ways that so amazing, there was sort of their normal levels of production and distribution were not really affected. Their volunteers and their employed staff were able to continue coming. There were some changes that they made in terms of social distancing, but on the whole, production was unaffected, and many of them, as I said, managed to scale up as well. And part of this was, because they were sort of embedded in the local communities, they were able to collaborate with other food organisations and groups, groups who were not able to sell their produce and sort of join together to help distribute. As one exception to this, which none of them necessarily mentioned in particular, but they talked about how they'd got all of their seeds in just before the pandemic started, and so they'd managed to do the sowing, which was great. So that meant that wasn't affected, but it did raise the question of, like, had the pandemic hit maybe just 1 month earlier in the UK, would that have been quite a different story? Because seeds were generally really difficult to get hold of for less commercial producers, or just kind of household sort of gardens and so on. So this also raises the issue of seed sovereignty, and definitely one of the areas that kind of was maybe called into question. But essentially, they knew their communities really well. So many of them teamed up. I've got a quote here coming up that kind of demonstrates this, how they were able to already identify vulnerable members of their community and help get food to them because they were embedded locally. So yeah, since COVID-19, we've been distributing emergency food bag weekly deliveries of vulnerable and isolated people. We adapted our food work, a community cafe, pantry and food project, to providing and delivering emergency food bags of vulnerable people. About 50% of our existing volunteers and 50% referred by GPs, social workers and mental health workers. We increased our subscription to Fair Share from once a fortnight to once a week. This food goes in our food bags of vulnerable people. So one of the next way, this is quite an interesting one, the precarious labour. So precarity in food systems has generally been quite dominated by looking at precarious labour within food systems. And there's quite an interesting dynamic to this with CSAs. So they often have quite a small and local labour force, which often has a certain amount of dependence on voluntary labour. So during the pandemic, while some CSAs restricted volunteers due to social distancing, others were largely immune from the major shocks to their workforce, and actually many were overrun with volunteers whose availability increased because of the furlough scheme. This raises interesting questions for the exploitation of those who can afford to volunteer, essentially. So, there's been many other studies pre-pandemic about white workers on organic farms and who is able to provide voluntary labour. But on the other hand, CSAs offer an alternative economic exchange format whereby wages are not the dominant measure of value, but a shared communal contribution to the production of food. This is based on reconnections with the local environment and people, with healthy and affordable food the ultimate reward. Indeed, CSAs often challenge the precarious labour inherent to the corporate food regime, with voluntary labour a positive asset indicating local sovereignty. Further, many of them also managed to employ additional people, such as drivers, to help meet some of the increased demand. And it kind of generally supported the sort of voluntary commitment and communal nature of it, often supported community well-being and inclusion and mental and physical health as well. Which is what I go on to next, which is precarious health. Producing in ways that opposite to the corporate food regime that are fueling infectious disease pandemics. Instead, CSAs are producing, providing healthy, fresh and affordable produce with well-being and community at the core. So one of them was talking about So this is one of the quotes: "More people have wanted to volunteer. Those who would have been working full time and have been struggling with the lockdown, having rhythmic work to do enables them to relax a bit. Mentally, the work is soothing." Another one talks about how food provisioning facilitated important social connections and a sense of community during the first lockdown. "It's been so lovely to deliver veg bags and find appreciative little thank you notes in empty veg bags, boxes of chocolates and thank you emails. They're really a great bunch of customers." And this is on top of a lot of them providing, really quite affordable food. Like one of them talks about, our subscription is £27 a month for a weekly veg box and so on. So their aim is to try and keep it as affordable as possible. They harvest, box up and deliver on the same day. So, they're trying to heal precarious health in multiple ways. So how am I doing with time? I've only got a few more slides left, but I just want to double check.
Yes, I think you've had your 20 minutes, but do you want to wrap up?
I'll switch through these last ones. So they also deal with political economic precarity, where they don't often get subsidies in the ways that many do. Just a final point on sort of precarious environments, they're seeking to heal precarious environments through ecological farming techniques, improve biodiversity and so on. And interestingly, they often, all of them stated that they, we didn't actually ask this, but nearly all of them stated that they don't have certification despite using the principles of organic farming, which kind of raises questions again about, what's the role of certification, and it seemed to be kind of irrelevant here. Customers often are also volunteers, and they know intimately where the food is from and how it's produced, and therefore the certification becomes less important. So yeah, these are just some of our sort of final concluding remarks. So yeah, I will leave that slide up there.
Great, thanks ever so much there, Lauren. It's Luke Owen here. I'm kind of sort of helping facilitate and chair this session with Jordan and Adrian when he comes. That was really great. Thank you. Yeah, there's a time for a few questions. So should we use the raise your hand function rather than just all shout out at once?
Yeah, put questions in the chat. That's fine, Luke. Yeah.
Does anybody have anything?
Shall I kick us off with a question?
Yeah, I've got.
So I think it's really interesting what's happened to CSAs, and you gave a really good overview of the kind of peak of interest. So I wondered kind of where they go from here. Given that they've had so much more interest, have their kind of their plans going forward change? Do they want to kind of become bigger or what? I suppose the question is, what's their kind of future? How do they sustain their interest going forward? I think I might accidentally muted you, Lauren, so I'm sorry.
That's fine. I assumed it was on purpose. That's fine. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting time. A lot of them spoke about how they were sort of long term, had like a 5-year plan to get up to whatever it was, like 200 customers or something, and they met that within like 2 weeks of the pandemic. So a lot of them have had to scale up. Some of them are, because they have lots of different structures. Some of them are much more about producing food and less on the voluntary nature, and have quite large customer bases. Others are really, really small, and they're like owned by a collective or run by a collective, and there's no financial exchange. It's literally like everyone chips in and everyone gets a certain amount of food out. So there's a lot of diversity within how they operate. So some of them were like, well, nothing changed. Basically we were sort of almost immune food-wise in terms of the CSA to the pandemic, whereas others really have been scaling up. And for sure, like some of that demand probably will have dipped now. It'd be interesting to do a follow-up study. But it seems to have sort of reinforced and strengthened their value, which is quite interesting. And a lot of them, there were some interesting sort of quotes reporting how this was really helping even further people, who are customers of CSAs are already going to be fairly aware of some of these issues and participating for a reason. But they said that a lot of their customers were sort of realizing even more the importance of like where their food was coming from and and supporting their local CSA and kind of being wary of like the empty shelves and the kind of scrabble for food in the supermarkets and so on. So, you know, I mean, hopefully it will be a kind of long-term boost to them. But, you know, like we kind of said at the beginning, it's not like this is the only answer. There's many different ways, and it's not like they're problem free. We're not being uncritical of them, but you know, they're certainly pulling their weight over the last year and a half, I think.
I think we've got time for one more question. We have to move on. Is there any more questions?
I've got one, Jordan, unless anybody else wants to jump in. So I'll fire ahead then. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed listening to your presentation. I like that you used the word precarity and precariousness. I think that's, I mean, you can probably talk another time about what's the value of that compared to, say, vulnerability. But I like this idea of precariousness, especially in the context of precarious labour and what's going on in the world at the minute. So I thought it was great. Yeah, one of the projects I'm working on is, I think we found very similar findings to you, and we weren't working with CSAs per se. We were working more with food partnerships and food hubs who are operating with, let's say, redistributed food. So not CSAs per se, but the same kind of issues cropped up. Volunteers came in to fill the vacuum. They were trying to access vulnerable people. So I think there's clearly something going on there at the kind of community scale broadly. My question is more, were the CSAs, could you say a bit about whether they were kind of urban, peri-urban, rural? Were they homogenous in terms of their makeup and their size and what they were offering? I'm just curious to know a bit more about those. Was it 15 you mentioned?
Yes, yeah, it was 15. So, you know, it was definitely like a very sort of small exploratory study, but, you know, we did try to get as much of a range as possible, both in terms of geographically where they were from, but also different sizes. And they literally range from like under 2 acres up to, there was one that was quite large, that were amazingly large actually for a CSA, but most of them were sort of between 2 and 4 acres. They were predominantly in rural areas, or kind of, sort of peri-urban and rural areas, which also was quite interesting in terms of, you know, what are the experiences of this, for what's the role of CSAs in rural areas, and for, you know, often sort of, I mean, to an extent, there's been a bit of a regeneration of rural areas generally in the pandemic, as everyone's been wanting to move out of cities, and renewed interest. But, you know, that was quite interesting, and how they're operating in that rural context. But, you know, there's lots of different structures, so they can be like, you know, some of them they'll be renting a bit of land, others they'll own it. It'll be maybe run by sort of person but as a community interest, others it's an, you know, a sort of cooperative, like, you know, they were really quite diverse in the different ways that they operated. So we covered like a fairly decent spectrum, you know, despite it being a really limited number.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I would like to talk more about the work you've done, because I think it chimes with a lot of what I'm doing as well. But that's for another time. Just quickly then, Stefan, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, because I mean, if you talk about diversity, I have to come in. I'm sorry about that. No, because I was wondering if you say that they are diverse with regard to how they're organized. I was wondering whether they are diverse with regard to the people who are active, because I found it quite striking from a non-English speaking background that you speak of customers in the frame of CSAs. I would rather go. We would rather talk of members
yeah,
the community, because it's a different approach on how you take it. But I was wondering, on the one hand, whether the range of the members or customers are rather upper middle class that you can see in most CSAs, because we did some research on the diversification of membership in CSAs. Because you can see that the members, because they have higher income, higher education on average, even though the CSAs would like to be more inclusive, that they would like to do some charity work and to help the poor people. You know, it's a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, it's good that they want to help, but on the other hand, it's the question that those that what you just presented, that those that are termed as precarious, they must not necessarily perceive themselves as being precarious.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting question. Thank you for raising it. And it goes often back to that enduring question in, who's participating in these kind of more socially, environmentally just food systems, right? And I think, there were some limits to the amount of data we're able to capture. And so, actually there was a certain amount of that we were not able to capture, and we just don't know. And that's actually where we've thought about, we were talking to one member, usually the lead contact for that CSA, and that was who was filling in the survey. So we really don't know in terms of their customer base. We'd get a rough idea in terms of what's the geographical range of their customer base or something, but that was kind of it. So that would definitely, it's something that we've already identified for it would be really nice to talk to some of the actual members and the customers. And that's another interesting point as well, whether members or customers, and they really vary depending on the type of structure they had, whether they refer to them as members or customers. Generally, if they were smaller, very much more of a collective, it would be members, but for the ones that were slightly bigger, it would be more customers. On top of that, again, the diversity of the structure really reflected this. So some of them were explicitly there as part of a kind of social project, and they had whole programs where a large part of the work on the farm was done with explicitly for vulnerable members of their community, whether they have learning difficulties, mental health issues, whatever it might be. And so that was where some of them had really good links to those. But I'm sure that there are some of the other ones where that wasn't mentioned. It wouldn't surprise me if they were very much the sort of more middle class, yes, we'd like to participate in ethical food systems sort of approach. But yeah, there were limits to our data for sure. But yeah, thanks for raising that.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, we could talk all day about this, couldn't we? But alas, time is against us. So thanks very much for your presentation, Lauren, and to the co-authors as well involved in that work. I'd certainly like to talk more about it. I'm sure there's others here who would. So yeah, thank you very much. And if we move on now to the next speaker, so I've just put in the chat box there the title. It's Britain's World War II Food Policies, their planning, implementation and results, and lessons that could help us transform today's food systems to be sustainable and just. And this is it Eleanor Boyle, is that right? Yes. I can't hear. Is Eleanor, you talking? I can't hear anything.
You're on mute.
Unmute.
There we go. We can hear you now.
Sorry, Eleanor. Yeah.
The basic mistake on Zoom, and I've made it.
Playing Zoom bingo on mute tick. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everyone. Shall I introduce myself just a little?
Go for it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
My name is Eleanor Boyle. I am joining you from the west coast of Canada. And I have become fascinated by this issue ever since on a visit to London, noting that the Imperial War Museum, which many of you will know, had a most wonderful exhibit called The Ministry of Food. And I was already a teacher and a writer. I have degrees in psychology and neuroscience, and more recently food policy from City University London. And I was absolutely fascinated by this case study as I think a group of lessons for us in what fascinates me, which is behavior change. How can we as individuals, as a society, animate the kinds of behavior change that we all need to improve our food systems and to meet the challenge of climate, of the climate crisis, and of course, COVID as well. So let me just say, by way of larger context, it struck me coming into this conference that COVID, climate and conflict, or pandemics, climate and geopolitical conflict or war are all very much bound up with food. Each of them can be even sparked, as certainly exacerbated, by food systems or by food needs, real or perceived. And then once these events begin, whether it be COVID or climate or war, those of course most affected are those already food insecure. So I think that we're very much tied together here, no matter what our specific focus of interest, because food is so central to it all. I'll take you then to 1930s Britain and a place and a time where the challenge of feeding people in crisis was top of mind, because war was imminent. And the nation was recently out of the terrible First World War, of course, and a depression, and was well aware that many of its citizens, millions of its citizens, were already, and it wasn't even wartime, were already seriously malnourished or undernourished. Britain as well in the 30s was importing most of its food, about 2/3 of its calories, on ships. It was not producing them domestically, but bringing them in across the Atlantic, the English Channel. And those ships, given war, would now be needed for military purposes and would also be targets. So that shipping was an important issue. And the government of the day, the conservative government of the day, led at the time by Neville Chamberlain, not being ideologically or constitutionally enthusiastic about intervening in markets, nevertheless began to make plans to take over the food system. See, there had been state intervention in Britain in the food system in World War I, as our colleague Bryce Evans, in fact, spoke about yesterday in one of the sessions. But it had been too little too late. And it may be that for some of you who are generations British, your grandparents or great-grandparents living in Britain were hungry, because a lot of citizens in Britain were, this couldn't happen again. So, time to manage food. And the objectives, as I have seen them through my research, could be listed as three. One, to produce more, to waste less. Three, to share scarce food. So to produce more, it was absolutely essential that Britain decrease its reliance on food imports. These ships were going to be targets of attack. It was key, as many of you were discussing in this conference, to waste less. Even in the 1930s, people in Britain had gotten complacent about food, and there was much more food wastage than needed to be the case. Third objective, it would be important to share scarce foods, and that, of course, would be through a rationing program. So detailed assessments were begun, including what could the capacity be for British farming. British farming was in the 1930s in the doldrums. Britain was an empire relying on its colonies to provide it with food. A lot of land across the country was pasture that could easily have produced arable food. So capacity of domestic farming had to be assessed. So there had to be an assessment of how many food imports could continue to come in, and even right down to how many calories the nation would need per day. And yes, those calculations were done. And the government had to really devise a complex suite of policies and programs for both production and consumption that would most likely meet the needs of what were then about 47 million citizens through a chaotic and completely unpredictable time. So programs were rolled out, and by January 8th, 1940, anyone who wanted bacon, butter, or sugar was carrying a ration book. Farmers were being directed to produce certain crops that had been designated as necessary and useful for the population. So one of the issues I'm going to get to in a moment is voluntary versus mandatory. I say things like citizens were being asked to dig deep, literally and figuratively, in their gardens, and saving leftovers, not wasting a thing, changing their eating habits quite thoroughly. But the fact is that they weren't asked, they were told. And I do think that the issue of voluntary versus mandatory cuts across all of the issues and the difficult situations that we're interested in, whether it be COVID, climate, or war. So if this ambitious program were to have any chance of success, a leader would be necessary, particularly to be Minister of Food. And of course, leadership generally was important in the war, and Churchill provided a lot of inspiration. But this gentleman, Lord, known by his title, Lord Woolton, was chosen to be Minister of Food. He was a business executive, very competent in administration and management, but he had also been a social worker. And this touches again on, I think, important issues of leadership in crisis situations. He had a personal compassion that we will see throughout the war years would come in very handy when he had to deliver bad news. He used to say, to sell an idea is much more difficult than to sell toothpaste. And he would insist on making personal announcements on the wireless, in the newspaper, when there was bad news, such as a few months into the war, letting people know that the ration would extend to their beloved tea. So Lord Woolton and his team began to rally citizens with an impressive communications campaign in many different media. I happen to be a great fan of the posters, and here are just a few of them, appealing to different demographics, as you see on the right, to householders, household decision makers, which of course were almost entirely women at the time. Children had to be brought on board, and some of the posters were actually artistic creations as well. And citizens were roused. Now, there's much more I could tell you about the programs, but I want to get on to the positive results of the programs. But first, as with any human enterprise, there were problems, there were controversies, and mistakes were made. And let me tell you about a few of those. I'm going to group them into what I'll call 4 categories: obligations, loopholes, black market, and competing interests. So Britain had the imperative of feeding 47 million people in a chaotic time. As an empire, it prioritized the needs of its citizens over those of elsewhere. And at one point, for example, it cut shipping, it cut food exports to the Indian Ocean, and tragically contributed to the Bengal famine there. So it's a bit of a black mark, a large black mark on the war record of these programs, but it was a reality, a sad reality of the time. And the other problems and controversies I'll mention are more home front. One is loopholes, and the programs were designed for a lot of equity. They were designed to apply to everyone, but people found loopholes, particularly the wealthy, who tended to have larger back gardens that servants could work in. Servants could go and queue at the grocers. And there were restaurant meals that could be purchased if you had the resources. The Ministry of Food ran around trying to plug loopholes during the war and was somewhat successful, but there was some resentment about the wealthy. Third, black market. A black market in food did develop in the UK during the war. Unlike the black markets in food in continental Europe, particularly the occupied countries, it was not a major factor. The black market in Britain was largely small scale. A few eggs that your chickens had produced in your backyard, you'd slip to the grocer for a little extra cheese. It was mostly of that variety, but nevertheless, you're always going to get people who don't want to follow the rules. And fourthly, I'll mention competing interests. And by this, I mean, for example, that decisions had to be made about how scarce shipping space devoted to food could be used. And there were questions when, on occasion, rather than nutritious food, what was coming in on ships was, for example, alcoholic beverages. I find it fascinating. I think the reason was morale. And the reason I call it competing interests is that morale is darned important in wartime. And that was probably the reason, but such decisions were definitely bound for controversy. So the positive results. First of all, there was adequate food for the entire domestic population. If you know the history or you speak with several generations back in your family, you know that there were teenage boys and manual workers who would have loved an extra helping. But for millions living in Britain at the time, wartime food, monotonous as it may have been, because there were a lot of food species they didn't have, nevertheless, for millions, it was better than pre-war. In 1936, John Orr, later to become first head of the Food and Agriculture Organization, wrote a devastating report called Food, Health, and Income, which outlined with all the evidence that fully half the population had not the calories or the nutrients to meet the most minimal nutritional standards. It was a devastating report for Britain. And for those people, wartime food was actually better than what they had. Next positive result. Not knowing where food is coming from, needless to say, is terribly stressful. And morale to fight the war was improved by people's knowledge that there was going to be food and that they were personally involved in producing it. Health. I love the picture of these lovelies. They, ice cream was not available during the war, and they are partaking of a wartime treat, and that is carrot on a stick. Yes, carrot on a stick is what the children were given. And it won't surprise you to hear that during the war, dental health improved, as it did. There was much less sugar intake during the war. There was also, for the British population, fewer calories, less meat, less processed foods. And on the very serious note regarding health, there were significant decreases during the war among the British population in heart disease, diabetes, and tuberculosis. And there was much improved maternal and child health. Most of it attributed by later reports to the transformed food system, the wartime food system. And it ties in with my next positive result, and that is that socioeconomic equality during World War II in Britain did improve. The inequality gap did narrow. Now, it has to be said that this tends to happen during war. There are jobs for the unemployed. There are taxes on the rich. So there are non-food factors that improve equity in crisis situations. But the fact that there was food for all played a large role. There were milk programs, meal programs in schools, which of course preferentially or disproportionately helped those from low-income families. And
So-
just
sorry,
one more.
Eleanor, sorry, it's just to say there's about 4 to 5 minutes left of this
Oh.
presentation. Okay, sorry.
Fine, absolutely, absolutely. Farming was revitalized with the help of the Women's Land Army. So let me skip to lessons for today. I believe that the story of World War II food in Britain presents us with 5 lessons, which I also believe are lessons for other situations that you're interested in. 1, change is possible. You know, food systems seem intractable and intransigent. The wartime food in Britain shows us that under certain conditions and in certain situations, change is possible. Meat and 2 veg was often replaced by this lovely recipe, which is Wilton pie. And I think we see today that changes in food systems are possible. You've all noticed the vegan revolution. It's quite remarkable, the number of young people who are vegan. I've been working for 20 years, educating people to eat less meat. And it has come as a shock to me that so many people don't want to take a small step in this regard. They want to take a big step. Kind of a fun metric, a lot of people are Google searching the word vegan. Second lesson, if people are going to support a transformation, they need reasons and they need strategies. The British government was very good about telling people precisely what they needed to change their food ways. And on the right, I have Canada's newest revised food guide, which gives very specific proportions for health and sustainability. Thirdly, leadership is required. On the left, Lord Woolton had that personal touch. He was born Frederick Marquis, and parents wrote to him saying, "Dear Uncle Fred, thank you for the milk my son is receiving in schools." He had that touch, and I do believe that the soft skills are important in leadership as well as the hard skills. On the right, I am here on the west coast of Canada. This is our provincial health officer. She, through COVID, has been so evidence-based and so calm that she has engendered a tremendous amount of trust, and we've even named a gin cocktail after her. I want to make one point with a poster about leadership. The World War II British posters were not afraid to use values language. I love the use of the word conscience here, and I think that we tend to believe that in a secular and perhaps cynical time like ours, that this sort of language wouldn't work. I think it might. I think people want to be called to service. For transformation, we need roles for all. On the left, you see boys in London digging up a bomb site for an allotment garden. And of course, you all know of many programs today, the color shot on the right, in which young people are learning where food comes from, which is not the grocery store, but the soil. And lastly, and my last point, I believe the case study shows us that sacrifices must be shared. When rationing was first announced in 1939, let me tell you, there was opposition. But within a few months, polls showed that the majority of the British population were on side, supported rationing. They could see that it was fair. And on the right, that is why I have written an article and others about, for climate, the need to ration emissions intensive consumption. So last example on the fairness issue, British restaurants on the left, in the black and white, were a way for the British government to introduce fairness into the food system, which we desperately need today. British restaurants were available to anyone for a few pence, a shilling, to get a good meal without ration coupons. And the idea has been replicated in Brazil, as you see in the color photo, with the Restaurantes Populares, or restaurants of the people. I hope that as we transform food systems, we can introduce more equitability. And I should probably stop there. I will say that I have a book coming out later this year. Let me know if you're interested. I thank Professor Emeritus Tim Lang, who many of you know, for writing a foreword and for mentoring myself and so many other people. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks very much, Eleanor. That was fascinating. Really enjoyed it, and some great visuals as well. Really, really, really good presentation. So thank you very much for that. Okay, guys. So as always, is there any questions? Again, if you wanted to use the raise your hand function, that would be great. So over to you guys.
I'll put a question in the chat. I mean, I just wanted to say that it's really insightful to have a historical perspective on what's happening at the moment. I mean, it seems like we're at the sort of time of great change at the moment. And it's great to kind of look back and see how this kind of unfolded in World War II. And I really like the kind of parallels that the British government were very good at kind of telling people what to do and rationing, etc. And that's almost what we've kind of gone through here with the pandemic and the messages, etc. Yeah, so perhaps the question is, I mean, do you think there are parallels between how the food crisis was managed during World War II and then what's been unfolding recently?
I do, and I think it offers us the basic questions. How do we made or catalyze or encourage behavior change in a crisis situation? And the mandatory versus voluntary question, always a difficult one, has come up in COVID as well. You know, should jurisdictions be requiring masks and vaccination in certain situations, or should they simply be asking? No easy answer to that one, but yeah, I do think the lessons are applicable to all of these crisis situations. I do think, though, that our governors, government, undersells us by thinking that we can't be asked or even told what to do. I think people want to help. I think with climate, for example, we read a lot of bad news. We don't get told enough exactly what you should do, exactly what you should do to help. People want to help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know. Do you want to respond to that, Jordan, or should we?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, isn't it? It kind of seems more kind of poignant at a time of war to give people instructions, but it's almost like we've kind of returned to, yeah, and there's different kind of responses to that. People that respond in such a way to say, you know, okay, I'm going to follow my government, and others that don't. And you could say that perhaps with the kind of climate crisis unfolding, there might be some more difficult decisions that have to be taken. You know, we return to this.
I believe that the climate crisis is our 21st century war, and I think we're going to be faced with some of the precise problems that your government was, and I say you because you were the front lines of the war. We were not. We were, you know, I'm in the colonies. We were far away. But yeah, I think we'll have some tough decisions to make. Yeah.
There's a hand up for a question. So should we have this question and there's two. We'll do this kind of it's nearly past. Okay, so we'll go to who's the first question?
Jaskiran, if you wanted to ask you a question, and then Stefan as well.
Hi, yeah.
Hello, Jaskiran.
Thank you. Hi, thank you, Eleanor, for your presentation. It was really interesting. I think one thing that really resonated with me was the idea about governors and providing good governance. I mean, not to make it political, but I think we're currently experiencing a crisis of governance in this country in particular. Complete lack of leadership, U-turning, and a government that's morally corrupt, in my opinion. But that's a political opinion rather than an academic one. But I think the larger question here is also about the sort of, you know, wider political and economic system that we currently exist in, and where I feel like potentially the comparison with World War II becomes a bit more challenging, precisely because of, I think, you know, Lauren mentioned it earlier, but this corporate-driven system that we currently exist in, the food system, is also very much influenced by a side sort of a result of that. I'd say, something that Michael talks about quite extensively is how governments and nation states have become subordinate in many senses to corporations and to corporate influence. And it's a deliberate sort of aspect of a very hyper neoliberal food system. So how does a very central, strong government have scope within that system, which is deliberately planned to sort of sideline strong governance in a sense, and
Yes,
and reshaping food and dietary habits, I suppose.
thank you, Jessica. Let me say three things. One is that there were influential corporations during World War II as well. So it's not entirely new, although I agree it's very problematic.
Oh no, I think we've frozen.
Oh, we lost Eleanor.
I don't know if you can hear us, Eleanor, but you've frozen. Oh dear. Okay, well, perhaps whilst we're waiting for Eleanor to come back, it's 11:30. Stefan, I know you've got your hand raised as well.
Oh, there we go.
I don't know if you wanted to just. Is it a question that you need? Is it a question or kind of a comment?
No, I mean, I just had a brief question on the issue of behavior change, whether it's a means or an end. But that's something we could discuss later as well.
Yeah, I mean, stick it in the chat box as well, and
okay, yeah.
follow it up with
maybe that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's 11:30, and I think if to stay on track, we need to move on. So, I guess Eleanor throws at a good time if there is such a thing. But when she comes back in, we'll just thank her properly for her presentation. But until she does, I think she's dropped out altogether, actually. Okay, that's a shame, but good presentation. So I'm just going to invite the next speaker. So this paper is the importance of small-scale farming and alternative food alliances for promoting resilient futures post-COVID-19 crisis in Brazil. And this is it Felipe de Silva? Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes, I can.
Hi, Felipe. Thanks for.
Hello.
Yeah, your screen is there. I can see that there. So as before, yeah, if you want to spend sort of 15 to 20 minutes presenting, and then we'll have some time for some questions as well. So over to you, Felipe.
Sorry. You can see the presentation? No.
I can see it, but it's not full screen. I can see it as a kind of inside your PowerPoint. If you make it full screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So good morning to all. I'm talking from Brazil, so it's 4 hours back compared with UK. And the title of my presentation today is the importance of small-scale farming and alternative food alliance for promoting resilient future post-COVID crisis in Brazil. This is part of my result, not necessarily the context of COVID, but the context of small-scale farming and understanding alternative food alliance. Brazil was part of my PhD. And I did my PhD at Plymouth University in Devon, England, was between 2015 2019, and then since the end of my piece, I decided to come back to Brazil. I'm here now my position in Brazil now is a postdoctoral research fellow at Federal University of Europe. This university is the university where I did previously my degrees in geography. And so it's quite important now for me come back to Brazil and especially this institution and promoting sharing knowledge in terms of what I did in my thesis during my PhD at England. So the presentation today, it is part of this result of my thesis, but how the importance of these critical global issues in the context of COVID. In terms of in theoretical approach, the concept of resilience is a concept which gives me insights, to understand the challenges in the context of COVID. In the context of the concept of resilience, I would like to highlight the concept of rural resilience, with its means the potential social innovation and social agents at the community scale. Resilience also helps us to understand the capacity of agricultural system to adapt, to transform in times of crisis, not in a short period of time, but a long term of time. It's a concept which helped me to understand in the geographical process, and also not necessarily across scale, but on the ground. This is quite important for me to understand the process of resilience through narratives, farming narratives, and from the people who live at the community level. Also, resilience give you ideas about new process of development in crisis, and there are many scholars at this moment who have explored the concept of resilience. I would like to highlight the concept by Welsh. According to Welsh, resilience gives us a kind of more plural theories, in special about emancipatory possibilities to understand development, not necessarily development from a theoretical approach, major dominated globalization, but also new possibilities to reframing policy debates, give you ideas of alternative methods, alternative narratives. So it was a concept very powerful in the case study area if you have trying to understand. In the context of Brazil, beyond the COVID crisis, as you know, Brazil was the second most affected country in the world in terms of deaths, in terms of people who was affected by the virus. We have so many challenges in terms of deforestation, changing, urbanization, power of agribusiness, and in the context of in the investigation, in the context of the result, which I would like to present here, is in terms of also the power of small-scale farms for building a rural future in Brazil. Not necessarily of the large farms. Large farms has been very well supported by national policies, by the federal government. Most of they have the best equipments for large agricultural productions, large farm investment in the capital. But in terms of the investigation, we like to understand in terms of it is more in terms of the small scale farms, because we have this contradiction in the country. One side, it is this large equipment farms which produce for the globalization, but on the other hand, it's possible also to see the contradictory conflict between this previous logic of super productivism agriculture, and on the other hand, also small scale farms, and now the political debate about agroecology. In Brazil, beyond the large farms and high productivism agriculture, it's possible to observe agricultural areas with low productivity level, with most of people is very marginalized. Small scale farms, for example, they are very affected by the non-support of the government, but also major agricultural diseases and begin in production areas, like areas for agribusiness, and then after, at some point, diseases and pests spread to the countryside and affected also small-scale farms. So you see from my study areas, we will present soon, so many diseases and pests with part of fruit productions from São Paulo, and affected nowadays this area. No. So I would like, in terms of a place-based research, I would like to present some insights I have developed in the last years, and the evidences from metropolis of Rio. So I would like to present here the possibility to understand the small-scale farming in a metropolis, even the second biggest area in Brazil in terms of population. Just to localize the people where we are here, we have the Brazil, South America, the state of Rio de Janeiro, and in red we see the position of the place where I have done my investigation. It's possible to see the metropolitan region of Brazil, Rio, and the east side of the bay with municipalities the majority of this municipality was agricultural production in the last decades, and from 1970 started a process of urbanization. We see nowadays different land uses, as it's possible to see from the mapping. It's possible forest, the urban agriculture. It's all this mosaic of land use. And in my presentation today, I would like to show the conflict of this context, but also to keep and adapt farming, small-scale farm systems, even in a metropolitan environment like in Rio de Janeiro. As this table shows us, Rio is the second largest area in Brazil, involves more than 20 million people in this metropolitan region. It's some first, but Rio is very significant in terms of the global scale of this population. As this map shows, different land use and conflict. As you see, we have conflict in terms of oil petrochemical complex. Is a very large area with nowadays dedicated by operation of and process of oil petro complex. Also beyond, this is a national project, but as the context of a Brazilian crisis, project now move to a more global international project, and 20% of this oil petrochemical industry is part of the Chinese capital. So we see basically a national project which now became a more global project in terms of investment of oil petrochemicals. Besides that, we see also in terms of just environmental pressures. We are talking here about a metropolitan region with its necessary to supply in terms of water 12 million people, and forest is very important to keep the quality of the water. So we see also in this land use environmental pressures. So farming nowadays, it's necessary to combine urban areas and also environmental areas in the agriculture. It's different from the last century, when most of the area was very agricultural in terms of landscape. The pressures is also, it's related about, like I said, we see here a big company with explore the quality of this area in terms of water resources, and also companies also explore these resources. Besides that, we see also conflict in terms of erosion, soil erosion. It's a landscape really very well explored in terms of this with area we've produced for domestic market, any for exploitation, but for the domestic market, cassava and corn and beans for centuries. So we see fragments of also degraded soil in this area. But according to Michael Wood's globalization, and I would like to include in the concept of globalization, the concept of urbanization cannot be reduced to subordination of the local global, not of the global to domination. The impact of globalization in reshaping rural places is manifest through process of negotiation as well, manipulation, hybridization. So in this presentation from now, I would like to see this process of small-scale farms trying to present a kind of more hybridization of this process of globalization, not necessarily subordination. But also this investigation go to around and trying to understand this kind of local macro politics beside the macro level which I presented previously. Farms in this area, even when you are in a very urban pressure, is still there, as we see numbers from the agricultural census, or agricultural production also is still very significant in terms of economy for this part of this intellect is periphery of the Rio metropolis. Numbers it's possible to see, but in this presentation also I would like to present 3 critical issues in terms of it's possible in terms of evidence from this rural and urban area in Rio. And I would like to show 3 critical issues from now and combine these critical issues with the of resilience. Critical issues like the capacity from changes and crises, it's possible to understand from the innovation and the transitions which has been made by farms in the area. Also combining different types of knowledge, and this is critical issues with it's very evident when we understand agroecology and alternative food systems from this urban area. And the third critical issues is opportunity for social organization and how they are open and they create links between the community and the local level to the global level. And it's possible to understand about the social learning, the process of social learning on small scale farming. So let's start for the first with capacity to learn chances and cases. And here I would like to present an example of a farm. Hello.
Sorry to jump in, Felipe, just to let you know, we've got about four minutes or so remaining.
Okay, perfect. Here we have a lady, and in this way to understand the capacity to learn, it's possible to see her capacity to change her farm in terms of from a productivism system to agroecological system, which she combined this fruit citrus and the Atlantic forest. It's possible to power of this lady to change completely the landscape of the area. It's possible to see one of the farming close of her farming, which is a conventional citrus farming, and her farming with its nowadays agroecological, where we see the possibility to keep and solve problems like the degraded quality of the soil, and also the forest production of citrus. Another libraries which is very interesting is the exchange of some of them who works in a kind of more urban environment, and when they come back to the countryside, they sometimes change the quality of these agricultural systems, as is possible to see from these pictures. And previously, the production was very intensive, and now the production is in terms of more small scale, but this is more involved also the quality of this production, not necessarily the large production of agriculture, but also involves here a more the quality in terms of the niche of the market in Rio, with attended those small-scale farms. The second process I would like to highlight the importance of agroecology. Agroecology in this involves the combination of different types of knowledge, and also these different types of knowledge involving beyond production, involving environmental services, involving public goods. What the meanings of these public goods is different meanings, but the most important is the biodiversity conservation, for example, or the power of the rural vitality even in this context of a metropolitan context. We see the ability to gain different knowledge, not necessarily knowledge from academia, but knowledge beyond. Like in this picture, we see the combination of beekeeping and also the citrus farming. So most of the kind of symbiosis systems, they help each in the production and also in the conservation of the nature. This involves beyond the formal knowledge, involves informal, and how important for us to informal knowledge nowadays. Farms experimentation give you so high insights, because they normally they experience it's through generations, and these involve a kind of social memory, which it's quite important to understand the rural futures and new pathways for the development. And the third critical issues which I would like to highlight here, each opportunity for social farming there in that area, they are very open, and they are to create political organization. It's possible to see from this picture, for example, normally they organize a month or every week between them field days, which they change and they share knowledge between the community, but also they present sometimes knowledge to agricultural institutions, like you see the result of these videos, with its participation of knowledge between agricultural companies, much of the knowledge made by the experimentation of farms through generations. This was possible because farms in that area, they are open and they understand the changes with they need to cope in terms of in a urbanized society. This research is based in, I would like to present here critical issues with, I think the presentation could give us insights. One, it's the farming resilience in a metropolitan context. And also we see the hybrid society context. Also, it is the importance to understand the invisible culture in urbanized society. Here we present, for example, small-scale farms communities in a metropolitan area. Also, the importance to understand developing from a more bottom-up and translocal strategy, not necessarily or like in the past, in the top-down development. An application of this approach to better target policies in Rio, but beyond. Also, we can understand this process in the globalization context, not necessarily in the global south, but also in different parts of the world. For the purpose of quality food systems, the small farming strategies, so emancipatory role of food, even in a metropolitan context, and especially in a time of crisis, which involves a political crisis, but health crisis like COVID, with show us the challenge to change systems, and especially I think these small scale farms strategies give you with so many insights. Like I would like to present presentation.
Sorry to interrupt.
So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present in this conference, this meeting.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you. That was right on time as well. Just about. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So again, as with the previous speakers, but just before we do that, actually, just to say Eleanor's previous presentation, I think there's a note in the chat box that Eleanor's back in the room. So yeah, I can see you there. Yeah, I can see you there, Anna. Thanks for your presentation. And also to Felipe, thank you for your presentation. We're working our way down the western side of Canada down to Brazil. So this is quite a nice sort of global session. Okay, over to you guys. If there's anybody in the room with any comments, any questions, any clarifications, over to you. Please use the raise your hand function. So there's something in the chat box here from Jordan. No, there's not anything from Jordan. That's the previous question. I
can ask a question if you like, Luke.
Adrian.
Adrian. Go on, Adrian, you ask a question.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation. I was just really interested in, it's quite a specific question, but I was interested in this spread of disease and pests from intensive to the kind of more agroecological areas, which obviously is very, very bad. I was just wondering the kind of mechanism behind that. Is it because increased use of chemicals and pesticides produces more resistant varieties and then they infect? Is that the mechanism through which it works?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is the big problem of Brazil, because as I showed in the previous large scale farms, they have capital and they have large investments to supply in terms of equipment, but also in terms of chemicals to control diseases and pests. Also, because every intensive production we don't have variety, we have a monoculture. Monoculture have, in terms of biology terms, give you more chance to develop diseases and pests. In the citrus farming, citrus is like a very globalized culture, agribusiness culture. But in the context with I have investigated in the case study area, it's not for exportation. It's a very quality citrus for the domestic market of Rio and for the regional context. São Paulo differently produce orange, in special for juice and also for to the globalization context. So, but most of the diseases now spread to the country and affect all orange citrus. And farmers from small areas, they don't have the capacity sometimes to control diseases and pests. And agros now show ideas to protect more. So the lady with a show is very creative in the ways, and she has become many strategic in terms of informal knowledge to save basically citrus trees to diseases, using for reforestation, using many strategies in terms of organic ways to control diseases. He also spread her knowledge to the area. It's very interesting.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Okay, so and is there any other questions from the room there? Anybody else want to? We've got another minute or so before we have to move on. So if there's any other questions? No. Okay, well, again, we can, if anything comes to mind or if anything chimes with your, with the next paper or with previous papers, then use the chat box function. but otherwise, thanks Felipe very much for your presentation. And I'm just going to invite the final speaker of this session before the lunch break. This speaker is Stefan Whalen, and
yes.
also your colleague Barbel.
Yes, but I think there are more. So
sorry, I can see on your slides. I'll let you take over in a moment. So yeah, conceptualizing diversity in food systems. Again, it's sort of 20 minutes or so. Then hopefully have some time for some questions and discussion. So yeah, over to you, Stefan.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And please interrupt me because I can't see the chat while I'm presenting. So please feel free to interrupt me when I'm over time.
Thank you. Yeah.
As you can see, this is an endeavor that there were more people involved, and it relates to discussions that we had over the last maybe half year, because we just started with a research project on diversity in food systems, and the acronym is Foodiverse. And you can see those that have been involved in the discussion. And what we want to do today is rather not answering questions, but asking questions, because so I need to say that we won't come up with answers to research questions, but rather have some questions to ourselves. And I think I would be happy to have yeah, some discussion afterwards on the way forwards. The project is about diversity in food systems, and we would like to find out what role diversity might play. And I think it relates perfectly to the overall topic of the symposium relating to the future of food. So what kind of future do we envision? But it also links, of course, back to what Eleanor said, linking back to the past, but also to the other presenters looking for alternatives. But I would rather, even though we take up some of the ideas that that we have heard this morning in the keynote by Moya on territorial food systems, I would rather not go into the divide of the industrial and the alternative food system, because that might also come across with some challenges if you divide. So looking at diversity might help to ask some other questions, some alternative, well, not alternative questions, but might help us to address the questions on how to advance more sustainable and resilient food systems. So we start the project with the hypothesis that a diverse food system is a more resilient and a more sustainable food system. And starting from that hypothesis, we are wondering how we can characterize diversity in food systems. Maybe that's a rather theoretical discussion. But as you will see, it's quite interesting, and I think it's rather important to ask that question also with regard to the developments of the past 1.5 years, when we see that we are living in times of crisis, in times of multiple crises with regards to COVID, but also, I mean, in the UK, you had Brexit coming for real. And of course, needless to speak about the climate crisis that we are facing. So we have to do something about the food system in order to change it towards more sustainable ends and to make it more resilient. And we think that sustainable, resilient food systems should be diverse. What we're doing in the project is looking at what might be sustainable and resilient food systems. And as to what I said, we're not distinguishing, or we need to distinguish the alternative and the mainstream food system, but we know that the globalized, industrialized food system is very problematic in various respects, and that the territorial or the alternatives, such as the CSAs we have been talking about, might be might come across with several advantages. But speaking of the food system, we do not start for example, in the European Union, we have the strategy, the from farm to fork strategy. And what we would like to do is to flip the food chain and to start with the food culture and eating. And it is less about the eating behavior or the shopping behavior of individuals, but rather on the ways that food is eaten, food is prepared, what are also collective dimensions, and what eventually are also historical ways of eating, preparing food that might be more sustainable. Because I think, and that was a very good point, and I have been very happy to have a historical presentation in this session, that we also can learn from the past ways of preparing food, of conserving food. It was also a trend that we have witnessed during COVID, that people started rethinking. In many European countries, the topic of bread was quite prominent. People started to making their own bread and discovering that it is quite interesting and quite tasty to make your own bread. So if we are speaking about sustainable and resilient food systems, we think that we need to start thinking from a perspective of food cultures and eating, which is very localized, which is very territorial in a sense. But because if we look at what is able to be grown or what we are able to produce in various regions, and that's nice having a European project, which is comparing various countries. We can see that, for example, in Oslo, in Norway, in the north of Europe, we might have a different food culture as, for example, in Italy in the south. And the same compares, it's the same if you compare East and West, for example, the UK or Poland, and we're in the middle here in Germany. So we start thinking from a food culture perspective. But what is also very essential is to look at the food chain, but not only with regard to the more mainstream food chain, but there are also alternative forms of provisioning, such as the CSAs that we talked about in this session, but also, and that is what Moya said this morning, might also be relevant to look at public catering as a way to achieve the change towards more sustainable and resilient food systems. And there are various other ways, such as food markets, farmers markets. The food self-provisioning might have also become more relevant during COVID. So there are various ways of procuring food that need to be considered, and there are diverse ways of organizing that food chain. And the last but not least important is also something we talk about in regard to a more sustainable and resilient food system, is to consider food governance. And nowadays, for at least from a European perspective, and that's also quite interesting from a historical perspective, that the European agricultural policy was set in place in the 1950s in order to safeguard enough food and in the last year safe food for consumers. And I'm always astonished that still a huge part of the European Commission's budget is on agricultural policies. And we think that food governance needs to be thought in broader terms if you would like to promote diversity, because you need to consider also what's happening in specific localities. So it's not only European policies that are relevant, but it's also questions how they are implemented on a national level and how they are tackled down to a more regional or local level. And if you come to the specific localities, we talked about that as well, about food policy councils, which might be different ways of organizing food in a more democratic way. So these are the parts of the food systems which we need to consider in order to make steps towards more sustainability or towards more resilience. And in case we would like to know more about diversity within these food systems, we think that there are different dimensions which are spanning across the whole food systems that we need to emphasize from a more analytical perspective in order to advance diversity. And the first dimension of this food system that we would like to emphasize is a biological, environmental dimension, because food is not just, I mean, there's the materiality of food that we have to emphasize, and that food might be understood as a chemical matter, as a biological matter. It has impact on, for example, the role of insects, the various species that are in the food system, across the food system involved. but it's also a way of diets. If you think of nutritional aspects of food, we know that dietary diversity might play a role, but we might also see that the diversity with regards to more biological aspects might be important. However, we also would like to emphasize in the project that in the food system, we need to consider a more social cultural dimension, because there are very social cultural specific ways of not only eating, but also very social cultural specific ways of handling food. Thinking about the historical developments of supermarkets, for example, it's a rather recent phenomenon that we take for granted nowadays, but there are other ways which might be social culturally specific, so that might be changing as well. And the same accounts, of course, for the food governance, which also involves human beings being culturally specific codes that need to be considered. And on the last dimension, we have a political and economical dimension that we need to emphasize, because there are various ways. I mean, we can consider diversity on a food culture and eating level, seeing that there are various consumers with socioeconomic backgrounds involved in food and eating. But also the different ways of how the food governance as well as the food chain is set up, and do we always need to think from a profit maximization perspective if we think of food? And I'm always a little bit surprised seeing that, for example, some alternative food systems such as community-supported agriculture still follow the growth paradigm that is following a more economist logic. So there are different ways that we can use these different dimensions in order to emphasize diversity. And we can see that in the literature, when we go to the literature, there are different kinds of diversity that are already known. For example, you might be aware that biodiversity is very important for the resilience of food systems, and particularly the agrobiodiversity, which is more linked to the biological environmental dimension of food systems. However, it is also related to the social cultural dimensions and the ways that we are producing foods on the farm. Next is a biocultural diversity, which entails, of course, the way of eating, producing, and also the way of procuring food, which might have changed and are changing along the years. And last but not least, there's also a diversity in modes of organization and coordination of the whole food system. And there are different ways, and what I just said already, that it is not necessarily that we follow an economist perspective, but also the questions, for example, on care might play a role, that we rather strive for caring for the environment, caring for other people, rather than maximizing profit within the food system. And what we are wondering for the project, and I think that's what we are working on along the next couple of years, is to see what kind of interlinkages we can find within the food system, but also with regards to the relations of the different kinds of diversity, because diversity is considered in these three bubbles that you can see here. But we were wondering, how can we characterize diversity and what are the linkages between these different kinds of diversity? And I think that's where the next step is going to take us. And I am hopefully going to present at the next symposium some of our results on how we can not only characterize diversity in food systems, but also put some more flesh on the bones and really provide you with empirical examples on the role of diversity in food systems. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to discuss them. And you can also send me, or please feel free to send me an email. You can find my address on this slide. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefan. That was fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it might be great to actually keep the slides keep the slides available, actually, especially the diagram. I thought that was really useful. Okay, yes, thanks again to Stefan and the team. So I'm going to go straight to the chat box first, and then we'll see if there's anybody wants to raise a hand. So Eleanor's back, and she's posted. Eleanor, shall I bring you? Do you want to ask the question there? Are you in with us still?
Thank you, Stefan. A fascinating framework. I hope you don't mind just a very practical question. However, sustainable food systems will probably require that consumers who are able pay more for food. We in North America are most guilty at expecting cheap food. But in Europe as well, I wonder if you see in your part of Europe some willingness on the part of consumers, again, who are able to pay more for better food?
I'm not really interested in whether they are willing to pay more or less for food, but that's why we really emphasize the food culture. And I think that history can teach us that there are various foods that can, traditional foods in regions, in specific localities, that are not necessarily considered as more sustainable. I remember a research project a couple of years ago, which was in Finland, and we were talking to catering professionals, and they asked us in a group discussion, what about a summer soup? They have a very traditional summer soup, which is vegetarian. Which is linked, or which is understood, the meaning of this soup is more to be a traditional soup, but not to be a vegetarian soup. So I would rather not go into that debate of willingness and who can afford sustainable food, because I think we are able to eat in a more sustainable way. And we have heard about the example of certification in the previous presentations, that there are different ways, the schemes which are not certified. I mean, of course, organic is, from a European perspective, the only way to guarantee the certification, but it does not necessarily need the certification if you are on a local level, where on the local level, the trust is created through other social mechanisms. So I would rather not go into the debate, oh, is it cheap or is it expensive, but rather how can I address the issue of sustainable food through the food culture and the ways that people are eating. Because if you speak to those people who eventually might not be able to afford organic food, they might have other ways of procuring food, or of rethinking the way that they are eating. And it must not necessarily involve only organic food, even though you might even think of it as a sort of gold standard. But on the other hand, there are also other ways which we would like to explore, because other ways might also lead towards more sustainable or resilient food systems.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stefan. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Great. So again, a couple of points in the chat box. So Lauren, like myself, would like to see the visual framework again. I don't know if you can.
I can show. Yeah, perfect. No problem. But then we don't.
Or add it as a screenshot to the chat box or something. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Brilliant. Yeah, so people can look at that and perhaps have a think about any questions that come to mind. I'm going to invite Fionn to ask a question if you want to, Fionn. So it's really around maintaining the level of diversity, maximizing across places and spaces. Does it mean more resilience is built into our food systems, and how can food governance help to ensure this? So Fionn, I don't know if you wanted to just rephrase that question, because I probably did a bad job of
that. No, I think you did a very good job of it. It's a difficult question because it's also implying sustainability and fair access in my idea of resilience. So I just know whether there's anything you could say about how this should inform governance to maximize all these different outcomes.
It's a very, very interesting and very important question, and I think what we try to do in the project is start from a more territorial perspective, from a more local perspective, or regional. You have heard this morning that the question of what is local food is very broad. I lived in Finland several years, and in Finland, in the north of Europe, local food is everything which is from the country. And the country is big, I can assure you. So the question of locality is, I don't think it stops at borders. And it is, of course, open for discussion and also fluid. But the role of how to bring in governance is that we try to work together with various examples in the project. And across Europe, of course, you have different countries and different systems in with regard to governance structures. And it's different if you take an example of a major city where a couple of million inhabitants come together and would like to promote a local food system, that if you go, for example, in rural Poland, you might have a different food system than in urban Oslo in Norway. And so I think it needs questions on governance on a more local level, because the problems are also specific at a local level. And I also agree with what Moya said this morning, that we should not fall into the local trap. I mean, there are some solutions on the local level. However, we need to have the governance structures on the also on national or transnational levels, that we need to set policies in place. And one of the outcomes of the project that we hope to achieve is a diversification roadmap. So a sort of tool, we don't know yet what this will be. So maybe in 2 years or 3 years time, we know more about it, that can assist policymakers, but also other actors in the arena, in the political arena of food, to diversify, because we know from biodiversity and biological systems that if they are biodiverse, they are more resilient. And we also know from management and organization studies that diverse corporations, diverse organizations, they are more resilient. So we think that also should hold true, and that was the whole assumption that we started from, for food systems, and that of course also relates to all the actors involved in the governance processes. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. I am also a little bit worried about the urban city region focused direction that policy is making. It seems to forget about rurality and the sites of production of most foods. Yeah. So just having that. Thank you very much for your reply.
And I think again, it's very important, and that's what we have seen already in various projects, that the urban-rural linkages. Of course, a place-based approach should take into account that there are different needs in urban or in rural areas. But it should not be the case that the rural areas are providing for the urban areas, but there's an exchange, an interrelationship. And I think that's also crucial for diversity, that this relationship can be different across spaces and also across scales. And that needs to be considered, how that relationship is shaped in diverse ways, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question there, Fionn, and Stefan as well for the response. Yeah, again, we've got a few minutes, so does anybody else have anything to add or to comment or to critique or to question? There's one thing I wanted to ask Stefan. Sorry, you're probably sick of my voice now, everybody. Yeah, I think one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is the COACH project, which is an acronym for Collaborative Agri-Food Chains. It's one that Moya is working on as well. She may have mentioned it this morning. I'll put a link in the chat box to the project website. Basically, the reason I mention it is because this is thinking about how to scale up collaborative agri-food chains, sort of short food supply chains, and this is very much with a focus on territory and this idea of building territorial food systems. And so I kind of riffing off of what's come out of that previous question is thinking about how does the territory apply in this case? So is there a role for thinking about territorial food systems? Has that something that's been discussed or thought about between yourselves and your colleagues? And I'm just curious to think a bit about that aspect of it, and what does the sort of the interface between diversity and territorial food systems or territorial governance look like? I mean, that might be something that maybe hasn't been explored or maybe it has, but I'm just curious to see how maybe that fits in with some of this. So Stefano, if your colleagues want to help.
Maybe if someone of the others would like to say, I mean, I have something to say about. I don't know if the others want to say something as well. Otherwise, I'm going to start because it's definitely a very important link, because you can see that from a territorial perspective, you can bring the different actors in the food system together, right? If the territory is larger or smaller, but still the territory has, well, even though there might be fluid boundaries of the territory, but still the diversity plays a role within it. And it might be that diversity of actors could be important that are involved in it. With regard to the dimensions that I mentioned in this framework. But I would rather be a little bit hesitant. We didn't talk about that in the project, but on some other aspects that we have been working, I've been working on with other colleagues, I would be a little bit hesitant towards the scaling up, because that is also again the economist logic of saying, oh, we need more alternatives. But in case that you see that the alternative food systems are growing, that brings also new problems. I did some research in the past on the sharing economy, and it was quite interesting that in the beginning, the sharing economy was more alternative in a way, say, well, we need to have a more sustainable way of living, but then it was taken up by hyper-capitalist venture companies, and it developed in something as we know it today. If you look 10 years back, what the sharing economy was back then, a different cup of tea. So a question that you can ask yourself is what becomes out of the alternative food network? It is when it is not alternative anymore, but it becomes mainstream. And we have witnessed, for at least, there was some debate in Germany about alternative food networks, for example, with regard to community-supported agriculture, and that some crop companies started to invest and researching and promoting the idea of some very huge companies producing a lot of pesticides had been very much interested in community-supported agriculture, and pushing also resources into it, which can be questionable, and how these things develop. So I would rather not going. I mean, scaling up is one way of promoting alternative food networks, and we distinguished in something that we have been working on, not only in scaling up, but also in the idea of scaling through, saying that you also need to involve, for example, the different actors in food governance, that's walking through the institutions and having the different actors being responsible for the development towards a more sustainable and resilient food system to make a contribution.
Thanks, Stefan. Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, we could talk more on this. Adrian's got his hand raised. I just want to invite Adrian to this conversation.
Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Stefan. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment on the territory issue. And I think one of the important things that you started off with this link between diversity and sustainability and resilience. I think one of the key things about this project is it's not just diversity for the sake of diversity, it's diversity linked to resilience and sustainability. And I think territory comes into that quite nicely, because if you're looking at varieties of crops and animals, it's very much about ones that are suited to a particular environment. And obviously, if you have that, then you get diversity across the system as a whole. And then also, if they're suited and adapted to a particular environment and are fit for a particular territory, it tends to be a lower input system as well, compared to kind of the monocropping and the things that we saw in the Brazilian example. So that's another way in which territory figures within this.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah. Okay. I'm last orders. Anybody, if anyone's got any burning questions or things they'd like to bring into the room before we close. No. Okay.
I'd like to say thanks to all the speakers.
Yeah,
it's been a really, really good discussion. And thank you, Luke and Adrian, as well, for chairing. It's been really, really good debate, and it's been great that we've had the time to hear from each of the speakers and had some good questions afterwards as well. And I hope that you've they've enjoyed it as well. If anyone wants to put their email in the chat as well, continue the conversation later. And as I said at the beginning, we'll make sure this is available online, so anyone who's missed the session today can go and watch it back afterwards. So it's now 12:30, and we're going to come back at 1 o'clock with 2 panel debates. I'll just share my screen. So the first of these, so stay here for the first of these on logos and logistics, the challenges, opportunities of certifying food production to promote sustainable consumption. This is this Zoom call, and then I put the link in the chat for the second panel debate. This looks at how businesses are being required to kind of report their food waste and the opportunities, challenges and implications of that. Yeah, so we'll have a half an hour break and we'll come back at 1 o'clock. But thank you everyone again.
Thank you very much all. Thank you.